So, picking up from our last discussion on navigating the skeptical path, let's dive into a fascinating question. Could we actually be ancient skeptics today? Think about it, Aristotle and Plato? Their ideas, while foundational, feel a bit dated now. Even their later followers couldn't just swallow everything whole. It seems putting your foot down with definite views is risky business. History marches on, knowledge shifts, fashions change. So what if the solution isn't to have stronger views but weaker ones? Or none at all? That's the core idea behind ancient skepticism, particularly the Pyrrhonian school championed by Sextus Empiricus. Could this strategy of avoiding commitment still work for us in the modern era? That's what we're exploring. Now, ancient skepticism wasn't monolithic. You had the academic school, famously associated with Plato, and the Pyrrhonian school, which is our main focus here. Both evolved over time, and honestly, figuring out the exact details is like archaeological detective work, mostly relying on fragments and second-hand accounts which can be biased. To keep things manageable, we're zeroing in on Sextus Empiricus. He's our best source for Pyrrhonian thought, and his major works, especially the outlines of Pyrrhonism, give us a clear picture. We'll stick to the skepticism explicitly laid out there, ignoring potential nuances or developments within his own writings. The big question remains, how much of this Sextus-style skepticism could someone adopt today? Sextus's skepticism has two main gears. First, there's the oppositional dimension. This is where the heavy lifting happens. You deliberately set up arguments or impressions that pull in opposite directions. Imagine trying to balance two equally strong magnets. Because they're so evenly matched, you end up suspending judgment. You just can't commit to either side. And this isn't limited to philosophy. Sextus applies it to grammar, rhetoric, even music. Second, there's the practical dimension. Why bother with all this mental juggling? For Sextus, the payoff is ataraxia, tranquility, peace of mind, freedom from worry. Interestingly, he suggests the skeptic started seeking truth to end inner conflict, only to find that suspending judgment itself achieved that goal. A bit of a plot twist. Let's zoom in on that first part, the oppositional dimension. How does this suspension of judgment actually happen? Sextus talks about assembling opposing objects and accounts. Think of it like curating a debate. You might use sophisticated philosophical arguments, either borrowing from others or cooking them up yourself. But sometimes it's simpler stuff, just everyday observations or common sense. The crucial ingredient is that these opposing sides need to feel like they have equal strength. When faced with them, you don't lean towards one, they just cancel each other out psychologically. It's like being pulled equally hard by two ropes. Sextus calls this ability to generate such balanced oppositions a key skill of the skeptic. It's not just about finding disagreements, but making them seem equally convincing. Okay, so you've managed to suspend judgment. What's the point? Enter the practical dimension, ataraxia, tranquility. Remember, Sextus initially thought finding truth would bring peace. But surprise! It was the act of suspending judgment that delivered the calm. Why? Well, one plausible story is that when you stop caring which side is right, the whole conflict fades away. You lose the urge to push your view and the anxiety that comes from knowing others have strong counter-arguments. It's like turning off the volume knob on a noisy argument. Sextus also offers another angle. Non-skeptics cling to beliefs about what's inherently good or bad, leading to endless striving and fear. Skeptics, by ditching these commitments, avoid that source of turmoil. Now, these two explanations might seem different, but Sextus doesn't really clarify if they're separate or linked. For now, let's focus on the first one, the link between SJ and tranquility. Now, let's tackle that tricky phrase, equal strength. What does it really mean? There are two main ways to read it. The rationalist interpretation says, you judge the opposing arguments to be equally good, equally well supported by reason. Since they're balanced, you rationally decide to suspend judgment. The psychological interpretation, which I tend to favor based on Sextus's text, is simpler. You just feel equally pulled or unpulled by both sides. It's a state of mental equilibrium, not necessarily a judgment about the argument's inherent quality. Think of it like being equally attracted to two equally unappealing job offers. You don't know which is better, so you hesitate. However, Sextus often talks about the necessity of suspending judgment, which sounds more rational. And when he discusses the modes, standardized skeptical arguments, it's hard not to see them as rationally compelling on both sides. So we need to keep both interpretations in mind. Here's where it gets thorny. If equal strength is the goal, how do you actually achieve it? especially across all sorts of topics. Does it feel like manipulation? Imagine you're deeply convinced of something. To get to suspension of judgment, do you need to actively suppress your strongest reasons and maybe exaggerate the opposing side's points until they seem equally convincing? It feels like intellectual judo using leverage rather than pure force. This becomes especially worrying if you're trying to induce this state in yourself, as Sextus clearly intends. The easy way out is to only apply this method where genuine uncertainty exists and where both sides genuinely have some solid support. But did Sextus assume this was always the case? He seems to treat it as possible for pretty much any theoretical question philosophers grappled with. Is that realistic even back then? All right, let's bring this into the present day. Where can we actually try this suspension of judgment thing? Pretty much everywhere there's disagreement. Think about ethics, politics, religion. These fields are rife with conflicting views, both among academics and the general public. Take ethics. Back in Sextus's day, ethical thinkers believed in objective goods and evils. Today, many philosophers argue ethics is just expressing feelings, non-cognitivism. Sextus might have seen this as undermining ethics altogether. But modern thinkers like Mackey or Hare embraced non-cognitivism while still building elaborate ethical theories. The nature of the debate has changed, sure, but the fact remains. There's plenty of room to construct equally persuasive opposing arguments on countless ethical issues. Same goes for politics and religion. The potential for suspension of judgment seems robust here. Beyond those specific areas, what about philosophy itself? Absolutely. Look at metaphysics, the philosophy of mind. There are tons of hot debates where newcomers often find themselves swayed by multiple strong positions. It's fertile ground for the skeptic's method. And then there's epistemology, the study of knowledge. Guess what? Some contemporary philosophers actually call themselves Pyrrhonists. Robert Vogelin is a prominent example. Now the author here argues that this neo-Pyrrhonism is quite different from Sextus. It often focuses narrowly on Agrippa's modes, concluding that rational justification is impossible. But isn't that accepting the conclusion? Sextus would suspend judgment on that conclusion too. Still, the author concedes that suspension of judgment about theories of justification, or even whether any theory can succeed, is definitely a live option in epistemology today. So the skeptic's toolkit finds plenty of material here too. But hold on, there's a major hurdle, the natural sciences. Here, the picture changes dramatically compared to ancient times. In Sextus's era, fundamental scientific questions were genuinely open. Was matter made of atoms, or was it infinitely divisible? Big arguments went both ways, no clear winner. Why? Largely because they lacked the experimental tools we take for granted. Abstract reasoning was king, and both sides had sophisticated arguments. Perfect territory for the skeptic. But today, science has been incredibly successful. We have atomic theory, the periodic table, cosmology, backed by mountains of evidence. Sure, there's cutting-edge research happening all the time, but the basic framework of modern science isn't up for grabs in the way ancient physics was. The playing field has shifted. And it gets even stickier. Modern science isn't just an academic exercise, it's woven into the fabric of our lives. We rely on electricity, antibiotics, GPS, plastics, all products of scientific inquiry. Unless you're doing some hardcore Cartesian brain in a vat stuff, questioning the existence of these things based on scientific understanding just doesn't make sense in daily life. Sextus often seems to imagine a neat separation between theorists and ordinary folks. Maybe theorists could exist without changing how people lived. But that's not true for modern science. Its results are indispensable. This makes suspending judgment about scientific findings much harder than Sextus might have imagined. You can question the theories, perhaps, but doubting the reality of the results? That's a luxury most of us don't have. Okay, so science seems settled and essential. But wait, there's a twist. Look around, and you'll see plenty of public skepticism towards established science. Sure, there are extreme cases like rejecting all modern medicine, but those are outliers. More common is situations where there's overwhelming scientific consensus on something, yet large swathes of the public remain unconvinced. Think climate change, think evolution, especially in certain regions. Here, the skeptic's method might actually find fertile ground again. Could someone construct equally powerful opposing arguments against, say, climate change, using the scientific consensus as one side and the vocal opposition as the other? It raises the question, can we suspend judgment here? Can we really achieve equal strength on these contested scientific issues? Again, it depends on how we interpret equal strength. If we mean rational merit, the answer is probably no. The evidence for climate change or evolution is currently far stronger than the counter-arguments. But remember the psychological reading? Maybe someone, bombarded by the sheer volume of anti-scientific noise, could be psychologically pushed into a state of equal inclination, feeling pulled equally by the consensus and the dissent. They might suspend judgment, not because the arguments are balanced, but because they feel mentally stuck. This feasibility hinges on the specific debate, the current state of knowledge, and the individual's susceptibility. It shows Sextus's ability needs to be flexible. Interestingly, Sextus himself sometimes used everyday opinions, like beliefs about gods, in his examples. Conflicts between science and prevailing worldviews, like Aristophanes' mocked in clouds, weren't foreign to him either. So this kind of situation, while modern, fits within a broader pattern. Now for complication number 2, and this one's a biggie. It relates to how we think about science itself, the philosophy of science. In ancient times, there was a pretty clear consensus about what science aimed for: capturing objective reality. Realism was the default assumption. Skeptics like Sextus challenged whether science could actually achieve this goal, but they didn't question the goal itself. Fast forward to today and things are messy. While scientific realism is still a big player, there's a whole zoo of alternative views. Verificationism tried to define truth by observability, didn't last. Now we have sophisticated empiricism, relativism, constructivism, instrumentalism. The list goes on. The core idea across many of these views is that truth isn't entirely independent of us. Our observations, our theories, our perspectives, our interests all play a role in shaping what counts as true. What does this meta-level disagreement mean for skepticism? Two things. First, from Sextus's perspective, these non-realist views in philosophy of science might actually look like ammunition for the skeptic. If science's theories are shaped by our perspectives, how can we trust they reflect objective reality? This challenges the very legitimacy of science's aims. Sextus' new perception could be flawed, but the idea that reality itself is partly constructed by our ways of seeing, that's a concept beyond his time. So, a modern skeptic transported to Sextus's era might find this line of attack highly appealing. Second, for us today, this disagreement creates a new arena for applying the Pyrrhonian method. We can debate realism versus instrumentalism versus constructivism. Can we suspend judgment about which view correctly describes the nature of science? This is a possibility Sextus never faced, as realism was simply taken for granted. So, while skepticism about specific scientific claims might be limited, skepticism about the nature of science itself is a whole new frontier opened up by modern philosophy. So let's recap. Where can we apply Sextus's method today? We've seen new possibilities emerge, especially in the philosophy of science, debating the very nature of scientific inquiry. But we've also lost ground. Many areas of science that Sextus might have treated skeptically are now considered settled fact. The bottom line? The ancient dream of a comprehensive suspension of judgment on all theoretical matters. Probably not feasible anymore. The world is too complex, and too much knowledge is established. Instead, suspension of judgment remains a viable tool, but it's more like a scalpel than a sledgehammer. It works case by case, depending on the specific issue, the available arguments, and the context. It's not part of some grand universal skeptical project anymore. Okay, so we can sometimes suspend judgment. But why bother? What's the payoff? For Sextus, the answer was crystal clear: tranquility, ataraxia. He believed there was a direct, reliable link between suspending judgment and achieving peace of mind. He famously said tranquility follows judgment as a shadow follows a body. He even admitted it happened fortuitously the first time, but clearly meant it was a predictable outcome, not random chance. Why? Because, he argued, when you suspend judgment, you're freed from the anxiety of an incomplete or unsuccessful search for truth. Does this still hold water for us today? The author argues compellingly that Sextus got this link wrong. Suspension of judgment doesn't automatically lead to tranquility. It depends massively on the topic. Consider mereology, the philosophy of parts and wholes. If you suspend judgment there, maybe you're calmer than the frustrated scholar still wrestling with it. But maybe you're disappointed you couldn't solve it. Now think about something huge, like the existence of God. For some, agnosticism brings relief. For others, forced into suspension when the question matters so much, it's terrifying. Or climate change. The scientist acting on conviction might be driven, while the skeptic suspended on uncertainty might be paralyzed, unsure what action to take. Tranquility isn't guaranteed. It depends on the person, the issue, and the circumstances. The link Sextus champions seems shaky. So, if we ditch the tranquility promise, what's left of Sextus's skepticism? The oppositional method itself, carefully considering all sides, weighing their strengths, still has value, even if it's less dramatic than Sextus presented. It's a recommendation for intellectual rigor, helping us avoid jumping to conclusions and guarding against dogma. The prediction that this process often leads to suspension of judgment still holds some promise. But the motivation shifts. It's less about chasing tranquility and more about intellectual discipline. Of course, the old problems remain. Forcing equal strength still feels suspect. But even stripped down, focusing on the process of balanced consideration, there's merit in adopting a more skeptical stance, even if the ultimate reward isn't the peace of mind Sextus envisioned. It's a modified, perhaps more pragmatic, version of ancient skepticism for our complex world.